What I want to start with this morning is a brief discussion on enabling. And this word's oftentimes associated with things such as alcohol abuse, substance abuse, things you typically want to avoid in your life, but it can really be applied to any destructive habit out there. For instance, you could say that a woman may enable her husband's abusive habits if she turned the blame on herself, and she would say, well, I know he's under a lot of stress at work and he's dealing with this and that makes him lash out at me. Or to use the alcohol as an example, maybe a man's friends down at the bar, they might enable his bad habit of drinking by buying him a case of beer for his birthday or something like that. Or you have someone who suffers from a gambling addiction, and again, if a wife puts up with him staying out late at night at the casino and he's spending money they're trying to save for vacation, maybe she just doesn't want to fight with him because she knows it's going to upset her and it's going to upset the kids. What she's really doing is enabling the bad behavior. And there's so many ways that we enable bad habits, sometimes we don't even realize that we're doing it. Enabling can lead to very serious consequences and even death. If you're a fan at all of country music, and this is not so much current, let's go back to the late 80s, maybe you've heard of Keith Whitley. His style of traditional country music in the late 80s started making him a star. He started putting out songs that were going to #1, and he was churning out hit after hit, and his problem was that he liked alcohol a little too much. He first tasted alcohol as a young teenager when his friends enabled the behavior by giving him bourbon, and then he graduated to harder drinks as a teenager. And the thing with him was he didn't have to drink every day. He could go days or even weeks at a time without having a drink. But once he gave into that temptation and fell off the wagon, as they say, he would binge drink. He would drink until he would pass out and would make himself sick. And it was just a bad situation. Things led up to May 9th of 1989, when at the age of 33, Keith Whitley fell off the wagon for the last time and he drank himself to death. When he was found, his blood alcohol level was 6 times the current legal limit. Now, over the last 30 years since his death, I'm sure his family and friends wondered what might have been had his bad behavior not been enabled through all the years. And country music fans wondered what kind of career might he have had he not been enabled by those closest to him. And it's a shame because he showed so much promise to be one of the best ever, but his life and career was tragically cut short. Maybe you know people who have enabled others' bad habits, and maybe it's drinking, gambling, abuse, sexual sin, maybe something completely different. Maybe enable financial irresponsibility. Maybe you know someone who says, hey, I'm just $20 short on my payment I have to make this month, and can you spot me the 20? I'll give it to you, next month. When you know that this person just is not responsible financially and they can't hold down a steady job and that kind of thing. Maybe you're enabling them in a way that you're actually trying to help them. Well, let's go to the Bible now and we'll look at a serious sin of David's, and we'll see how this was certainly enabled for years prior to this happening. And of all the sins I think are detailed in the Bible, I'd have to put this near the top as among the worst ones. It may only be surpassed by Judas's betrayal of Jesus. That certainly, I think, takes the top spot. And the odd thing is that this sin was done by a Christian in the Old Testament sense too, of David. So The chapter goes on for 27 verses, and it would be good to read the whole thing, but just in the interest of time, I wanted to forego some of the details in there in the middle. So I want to start by reading the first 5 verses, and then we'll finish up with the last 6, because that really gives you the bookends and the gist of what was going on here. So if you're following in your Pew Bible, you'll find the first 5 verses on page 221. We'll read 2 Samuel chapter 11 from verses 1 through 5 to begin. And it says, "In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, 'Isn't this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite?' Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. She had purified herself from her uncleanness. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David, saying, 'I am pregnant.'" Now let's move to the next page, and we'll finish up. This middle part tells you how David engineers this heinous plot to have Uriah killed. And hopefully you're familiar, at least generically, with that story. So that's why I didn't want to spend a lot of time on it here. And we will pick up the story in verse 22, and we'll read to the end of the chapter, which is verse 27. So in 2 Samuel 11:22, it says, "The messenger sent out, and when he arrived, he told David everything Joab had sent him to say. The messenger said to David, 'The men overpowered us and came out against us in the open, but we drove them back to the entrance of the city gate. Then the archers shot arrows at your servants from the wall, and some of the king's men died. Moreover, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead.' David told the messenger, 'Say this to Joab, don't let this upset you. The sword devours one as well as another. Press the attack against the city and destroy it. Say this to encourage Joab.' When Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. After the time of mourning was over, David had her brought to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord." May the Lord's blessing be added to the reading and the hearing of his holy word. This chapter here, bad as the situation is really part of the reason why I love the Bible so much, because it doesn't pull any punches. It doesn't show us just the good parts. It shows us the good, the bad, and the ugly, and everything in between. And when you compare it to what we looked at last week with David showing such love towards Mephibosheth, we're thinking, David's a great guy here, he can never do anything wrong. Well, we stand corrected in this chapter here. And if you remember, a couple weeks back, we were looking at 2 Samuel 3, and I mentioned in that message that David had more wives than Liz Taylor had husbands. And that says a lot. I think Liz was married about 7 different times, and David had a lot more than that. Now, it was a different culture back then, that's for sure. And in that culture, it was not uncommon for men to have multiple wives. But it poses a problem when a man is king, though, because God's law specifically told the Jewish people that a king must not have many wives. So you could argue, well, David wasn't actually king in the palace. Maybe when he married wife number 2, 3, 4, and I don't know how many he had by the time he became king. But even so, it's not really much of an excuse, because if you go back further, you know that he was anointed to be king. He knew he was going to be a king by the time he was very young, possibly even time before he was a teenager. So he should have been planning for this all along and showing some more restraint where that's concerned. And this is what makes the events in 2 Samuel 11 worse, because if David isn't exercising restraint, none of this terrible stuff would happen. When we talk about enabling people to do wrong, 2 Samuel 11, this chapter here could be the perfect story of when the perfect storm hits, when those things happen together, when people enable each other to do things they shouldn't do. A common sign of enabling bad behavior is simple. You simply ignore the bad behavior. It's not a problem. He doesn't have a drinking problem, doesn't have a gambling problem, doesn't have an abuse problem, whatever the case is. And you see here, when we're not reading verse by verse, chapter by chapter, but if you would go back and do that, you would see that we don't read of a single person ever showing their concern to David about his lack of romantic restraint. We'll put it that way. Now, admittedly, this is what we call an argument from silence, which isn't the best argument to make, just saying that if it's not there, then it didn't happen, and we know that's not the case. The Bible doesn't tell us every moment, every word spoken by every person, so maybe it was just not important in the author's interest to say that someone mentioned this to David. But there could be some merit to it here, because his actions were so bad. You would think that God would have preserved in his Bible, his holy word, the fact that at least somebody recognized this along the way and mentioned it to David. We don't see it happening, so maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. I seem to think there's some merit to it, though. And it's a lesson for us, though, detailing to us what can happen when we don't express to our brothers or sisters in Christ about things that they are doing. You know, we just think, oh, well, they're my friend and I don't want to make them upset and it's not that big of a deal, really. Well, we don't really know what is going on in a person's head, going on in their lives. So we also talk about, I don't want to judge that person either. Well, there's a whole different sermon on that, because judging doesn't always mean what we think it means. We see here that David was enabled, he took it too far, and lives were destroyed in the process. So I want to make it clear that regardless of who enabled David to do what he did, he's still ultimately responsible for his deeds. And it's just that since he was enabled over so many years, it made it so much easier for him to pursue Bathsheba. Now, the second point this morning is when we enable others to do wrong, what we're actually doing, and we may not even know we're doing it at the time, is we are enabling Satan to be successful in his temptation of us. We're probably enabling a bad behavior when we don't even realize that we're doing it. And I'll use another example. I'll just use alcoholism just because it's very common, just for a minute. Let's say you have a mother of, say, 25-year-old, just picking a number here, 25-year-old son living in her basement, and he drinks excessively. And every weekend he goes out with his buddies to the bars and parties and does all the things that he wants to do without restraint. Crawls in at the early hours in the morning, doesn't even know where he's been, who he's been with, and how he got home, and it's a bad situation. So when the mother finds him in the early hours of the morning sleeping on the floor and can't even get to his bed, well, she does what a loving mother naturally would do, and she helps him to bed, she tucks him in the morning, she fixes him a good breakfast, pot of coffee, eggs and bacon, gives him a painkiller to deal with the hangover, all that kind of stuff, and basically makes a big fuss over him. Now, in her mind, she thinks she's doing a good thing. She's doing what a loving mother would do, and that's take care of her son. But what she could be doing by doing this is enabling this bad behavior to continue in the future. Is she thinking that, this is going to change him? Well, he's thinking, I go out, I do this, mom makes a fuss over me, guess what I'm going to do next weekend? The fact is that many, like the mother in the example, often refuse to listen to reason too if anyone counsels her about what she's doing. Have you ever heard people say things like, well, what am I supposed to do? Just let him lay there? Or, so many other excuses that people give. And it's a bad situation all around, and it's easy to say when we're not in that situation. We understand that. But when you see a pattern of things happening, maybe tough love is the prescription. Now, here's the upshot of all of this here. We live in a sinful world, we know that. And there are times whenever there's things we should do, and if we want to do those same things, well, that fits pretty nicely. But oftentimes the things we should do are not the things that we want to do, so they don't exactly fit. And that could be a situation with the mother and the son in this example. Maybe one weekend, if she doesn't help him, then maybe the light bulb is going to go on in his head and realize, hey, mom's not making such a fuss over me again, and maybe I ought to change my ways. Probably not going to happen the first weekend, but with a pattern of, her not helping, maybe it can help in the long run. And people know whenever they show tough love about situations like this, well, that person is typically acting in a very self-interested manner. He wants to do what he wants to do, so you had better believe that the first time that she stands up to him and shows tough love, he's probably not going to be very happy with her, and he's going to express hatred and self-pity and things like that, and it's just the result of a sinful world that we live in. But back to David now. It is possible that there were some people who were even fearful how he would react to them if they mentioned about his escapades with women and all the wives that he had. Another common sign of enabling dysfunctional behaviors when people act out of fear. David, as king, would have the authority to punish anyone that he wanted. That came with the job. So I'm sure they were fearful of him saying, off with your head, if he really wanted to. So just think about how different things might have been if just one person had come to David and expressed their concern about his situation. Maybe it would have made a difference, maybe not, but we just were left wondering because we don't have any record of anyone ever doing it. And because no one made an effort to stop David, God then, later on, we'll read next chapter, had to send the prophet Nathan to deliver a much more serious message to David, and we will look at that one next week. But that's what happens when we enable the enemy to gain small victories along the way. Small victories tend to build a wall in our lives, and it's difficult to tear that wall down when it gets so big. It's not impossible to do, that's the good news, but being realistically, it tends to be very hard to do. And for David, the wall that the enemy was building in his heart said, what I'm doing is just fine, I don't have to repent, nobody else knows about this, and I'm not hurting anyone. By the time David learned that his relations with Bathsheba produced a baby, well, that wall was so strong and firm that he didn't even consider repenting in this chapter here. He went straight to the next step, which is the cover-up. We got to now set this up a different way so that things look a lot better than what they are. And that's what made the problem infinitely worse, the cover-up. And notice also here, there's a lot of things that are not here that really make a difference, and there's not a single reference to Satan in this chapter either. But you know that he had his eye on David from way back, certainly his whole life, but especially since he was anointed king. He was trying to find where David was susceptible to sin. And We've talked at length in the past about times when David had the opportunity to kill Saul so he could take the throne. Satan tried that tactic. David resisted it. There were times whenever people close to David said, "Hey, David, I'll do it for you," because they had something to gain too. David resisted that as well. Then Satan found this sin, and he went right for it, and Satan learned a lot, as well as the rest of us, in what happened here. All that David needed was the opportunity to be pacing back and forth on his rooftop, notices a beautiful woman bathing nearby, and that was like the spark in the proverbial powder keg. It's a culmination of giving it a little bit here, a little bit there. And all the people in David's life who kept their mouths shut, they didn't say anything, they were the ones who really did the hard work for the enemy. They made it easy for the enemy. And Satan has an easy job, relatively easy job to do, because every day in the world he has so many accomplices out there. But just as the enemy was there all along, the good news is God was there too. And that's the third and final point this morning. We skipped over the middle part of the chapter just for the sake of time. I hope you go back and read the whole chapter in the entirety this week to fill in the blanks. When you read through that, though, take notice that there are several occurrences of the word Lord in this chapter, and notice that they're all spelled with a lowercase l, except for one. And lowercase l is just like calling someone sir back then. It was just a title. You're not worshiping them by saying Lord David and so forth. But the one with the capital L is at the very end of the chapter. And that's the one that refers to God. Capital L is God. That makes sense. So the reader isn't even made aware of God's presence until the very end of the chapter, after all these things happen. But God knew everything along the way, and the Bible tells us it displeased God. And the word displeased is very interesting too. I don't think it's actually a strong enough word, but I don't know any better. I don't translate the Bible or anything, so we use what's there. When you look at other usages of this word, you can tell we're not talking about a mild irritation that, I'm displeased with something. I've told you time and time again that I have the deep freeze downstairs. That's the ice cream stash down there. Summertime, I need it especially to, not keep running to the store every day. And if I go downstairs and I get, the hunger for some ice cream, and if I find out that there is not any left, I will be displeased. Okay, I'm not going to get angry, start throwing things, making a big fuss. Okay, I'm sort of not happy about it, but I know that tomorrow, the moment that the store opens, I'm getting myself some ice cream to replace what was eaten, and I'm going to tell the others in the household, you eat the last bit, you tell me. So anyway. And I'm going to have the double portion tomorrow, by the way, to make up for what I didn't get today. That's the kind of displeased that I experience, but it's not the kind of displeased that describes God. Whenever David sinned the way that he did, whenever he impregnated Bathsheba, he obviously cheated with her. He gets his Uriah drunk, by the way. We skipped that part. Writes a letter to the commander of the army to have him put on the front line of battle for the intent of having him die in the mission, and then going and marrying Bathsheba, or Uriah's widow. This didn't just displease God, this infuriated God. And there's something else going on with this word displease I want to mention. Look at the usage in verses 25 and 27. David says, "Do not let this matter displease you, for the sword devours now one and now another." Then it says, after the baby is born, "But the thing David had done displeased the Lord." Now, the second time that we use this word, the author is really using that word against David. The first time he says it, then the second time the author is using it himself. So we're saying God, on the other hand, is much more displeased than David. You're telling him to be displeased. God's seeing all this happening. He's much more displeased. If David were walking closely with God during this, then he would know God would be displeased and upset. And sadly, there's no clue here that that David knew his actions would disappoint God. It's a result of being enabled. When we read the story of the sin with the Bathsheba and we explore it in detail, I think the first response from many people is, what a bad guy David is. I mean, how can you call yourself a Christian in the Old Testament sense anyway? If you go through the 10 Commandments, he broke at least 9 of the 10 right there in one episode. The one he may not have is the Sabbath, if it didn't happen on a Saturday, and we don't even know about that. He dishonored God, he dishonored his parents, he's guilty of murder, bearing false witness, adultery, and we can go through all the others. And we point our finger at David, but how do we compare to David? Well, first of all, we can say, I've never murdered anyone. Well, not so fast there. In the Sermon on the Mount, what does Jesus say? You have heard it was said to people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to the judgment. But I tell you, anyone who is angry with their brother will be subject to the judgment. So the question is, you ever get angry with someone? Did you ever call them a name? I know I have. And we're guilty just like David. Well, I've never committed adultery. Stop there again with the same Sermon on the Mount. What does Jesus say? You've heard it was said, you shall not commit adultery, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has committed adultery with her in his heart. So I'm pretty sure anybody who's just about reached the age of puberty probably has violated that one too. And we can go down through the list of all these things and compare us to David. And maybe it manifests itself differently in our lives than in David, but at the end of the day, I don't think there's a whole lot different between us and David. And the analysis doesn't leave us in a very good situation then. Maybe we're not so much better than David after all. Now, have you ever done something wrong and not felt bad about it? Well, next week we'll see how David responds, and if we've ever sinned without remorse, spoiler alert for next week, David had remorse, so maybe David's a little better than we are in some circumstances, despite all the things he'd done. And now that the tables have turned, where does it leave us? 1 John 2 says, I write this to you so that you will not sin, but if anyone does sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous one. He is the atoning sacrifice for our sins, and not only for ours, but also for the sins of the whole world. That's it right there. All the sins David committed, as well as the ones that we have committed, are all deserving of death. The Bible clearly tells us that: lying, adultery, coveting, murder, all that stuff. And that's why in the beginning I mentioned country music singer Keith Whitley with the alcohol poisoning, drinking himself to death. Death is just the response. That is the result of our actions that we do apart from Jesus Christ. So even though it seems pretty dismal, especially what David did, there's always good news. And that's what the gospel means. The word gospel means good news. Jesus Christ obeyed his Father to the point of death to be that atoning sacrifice. So when we sin, we would not have to bear that same penalty. When Jesus was the cross, he was there for the sins of David and Bathsheba and Keith Whitley and all of us here. And if we choose to accept his sacrifice in our place, then we will experience eternity with Christ once and for all. When we sin, we don't get off scot-free. As we'll see next week, we still see there's punishments for our wrongdoing, but that pales in comparison to what we actually deserve, which is death. And that's a testament of the graciousness and the love of God, that not only should that make us stop and think, but also make us very thankful as well. So let's close out now with a word of prayer.